Hey guys, today we're going to be designing all the elements necessary for After Effects to create your very own comic book intro like the one you just saw. This project makes use of free pictures and graphics, and I supply some of the files to help get you started. Check the descriptions to get them. The programs I'll be using are Photoshop and Illustrator from Adobe CS 5.5, but you'll be able to achieve comparable results with pretty much any version of the software. Once we're done with our design, we'll move it into After Effects, ready for animation, so be sure to catch part 2, which I've linked on screen and in the description below. Lastly, if you're new to my channel, which is almost everyone at this point, I just want to say welcome. Hit those like and sub buttons to catch more cool tutorials and other shits in the future. Terms and conditions apply. Thanks for watching. We're going to start by getting our elements together, and to do that, we'll start at a site called freepik.com. Freepik is great because it usually only requires a credit to the author for full use. Here I've typed comic book art as a search term, and you can see all the great elements already. We're looking for some cool action bubbles and background elements to spice up our images in Photoshop. Next we'll go to a site called psdcovers.com and download the free version of their Photoshop extension. We'll be using this to create the comic book itself once we've edited all the images. Now let's take a look at the other assets we'll be using to create this project. 1x cheesy superhero intro audio file, the comic book elements from Freepik, a logo to be displayed on screen during the final panel of the animation, and the pictures to be used for our panels. These pictures are from my friend Diego from Arcade Heroes, a new channel here on YouTube. I'll link them below if you want to check them out. Diego did a really good job of telling a story in a short number of pictures, which is exactly what we want for something like this. Last is a picture of our set, which I've made available to download below. The set is where all of the action and our comic book is going to live. Now that we have all of our assets together, let's fire up Photoshop and get started. Because we're working within the Adobe range, the first thing we're going to want to do after bringing our images into Photoshop is to save them as PSD files. I'm using the naming convention panel underscore and then the panel number just to keep my files neat, and I recommend you do the same as a good practice to learn. We're saving these as PSDs because it will allow us to make quick fixes and changes on the fly without needing to replace anything, one of the beauties of working in Adobe. After the panels, we'll do the same with our set. We'll call this background. Now let's start turning our plain images into exciting comic book artworks. I create 2 duplicates here, but you actually only need 1 to start with. You'll see what I mean just now. Double click the original and rename it to original. Now double click the copy and rename it to edit. Here I renamed the third layer halftone, but we'll actually be duplicating the edit layer later to make this layer, so ignore this for now. Let's hide the other layers. Make sure the edit layer is selected and select the image menu at the top. Move to adjustments. And these 2 top sections are where we're going to be spending most of this tutorial. Let's start by selecting levels. While this isn't going to be an in-depth discovery into any of the effects we'll be using, the levels effect in short allows you to adjust the range of white and black in your image. By bringing the ends in slightly, you essentially squash the colors at the ends of the spectrum, and by adjusting the slider in the middle, you shift the midtones to either direction. What we're looking to do here is to create some nice contrast and shift the colors to look a little bit more vivid, but keep it subtle. Next we'll go to the brightness and contrast, which does exactly as advertised. Crank up the contrast to hype the colors and adjust the brightness until you have a nice balance of shadow and highlight. That looks good. Click OK. Next is curves, and while this will differ for every picture, a good shape to start with for your curve is a shallow S. Again, you're looking to enhance the contrast between the colors and bring the colors out without whitewashing them. Let's take a look at the difference. Look at that. With just a few small tweaks to the levels of this image, we've already enhanced it so much. Pretty crazy. Let's move on. Next we look at vibrance. Ironically, vibrance here is less important than the saturation slider below, which will allow you to shift some of your tones towards a different hue. Here I use it to add a bit more orange to his skin tone to give him a slight bronze glow. Now hue and saturation. This allows you again to shift your tones through the color spectrum. You can also do this for individual color channels, but it shouldn't be necessary for this. Again, all we're looking for here is subtle enhancements. Little by little they all work together. Now go to the exposure and adjust the gamma. This has a really wonderful effect on the way the colors are displayed. Play around with the slider until you're happy and then click OK. And that's it for editing the picture itself. Here I delete the unnecessary halftone layer I made earlier and instead duplicate the final edit layer. I correctly named this layer halftone. Desaturate the halftone layer by pressing Ctrl-Shift-U. Now we use the halftone filter. This might be in a different place depending on your version of Photoshop, but on CS 5.5 it's under Filter, Pixelate and Color Halftone. The radius is the size of your halftone brush, while the channels depict the halftone offsets from each other. For our purposes, however, we're going to input whatever number we choose for the radius, in this case 30. Looks pretty cool. Maybe a little small. Let's go to the blend modes and select overlay to see how it looks. Drop the opacity down to push it more into the picture. Let's try another one. Duplicate the edit layer, desaturate, filter, pixelate, halftone. Now let's try 50. No, 70. Now that looks good. I'm going to delete the first halftone attempt. We don't need it anymore. Rename this new one halftone. And that's it for panel 1. We'll be using this exact process on all our panels as well as our background set, along with making other additions and edits along the way. One of the adjustments you'll definitely want to make is to clean up your halftone layers. As you can see now, it's completely infringed upon the clean newspaper print, which looks really sloppy. Grab your eraser and lower the flow and opacity down a bit. Now use the eraser to clean up the halftone and bring back some of the original details of the picture. Here I use the eraser to both clean up the image as well as bring some variation into the halftone itself. Nothing in life is perfect, and these subtle imperfections help add to the realism. Here I consider red halftone, but decide against it. And here we're looking to introduce our first vector element from FreePick. Generally, these elements will be grouped behind what's called a clipping mask. To access them, you need to right-click and choose Release Clipping Mask. You might have to do this more than once. What I'm looking to use is this invisible outline. I select it with my cursor and press Ctrl-C to copy. Now I move into Photoshop and paste with Ctrl-V. Paste it as a path. From here you can adjust the path using Free Transform by pressing Ctrl-T. Use the boundary box to resize and rotate until you're satisfied. You can hold Shift while resizing to constrain the size of your path. Once you're happy, press OK. Now go to the Paths panel on the right. Hold Ctrl and click on the thumbnail. This turns the path into a selection. Move back into the Layers panel. I've created a new layer called Background. Make sure it's selected. Change your background color to red and press Ctrl Backspace to fill the selection with the background color. Play around with the blend modes and pick one that looks good. Multiply seems to work well here. I'm not happy with my original placement, so I undo my moves by tapping Ctrl-Alt-Z a few times to step back. I tried doing it in white before finalizing on red. I left this part in to encourage you to always be experimenting. The worst thing that can happen is you'll learn what you don't like. Now, with your background layer selected, add a layer mask. With the mask, we use the brush tool and paint the mask in. This allows us to cover up our element without actually destroying it, as would be the case with the eraser. Here I use the brush tool and paint the parts of the background away that I wish to be hidden. And there we go, now background is where it should be. I use an irregular eraser here to give a more mottled look to the halftone. You can access the eraser menu by right-clicking anywhere in the work area with the eraser tool active. I grab another element and place it using the exact same method. Here, the lasso tool is perfect for making a quick and easy selection. I use Shift X to switch the black to the background color and press Ctrl Backspace to fill the mask with black. Here I create two layers with two red rectangles and set them to multiply blend mode. I use free transform and position them as extra design elements to help break up the lines a bit. Sometimes you might have to clean up the vector a bit before you can use it. Here I wasn't happy with the positioning of the elements, so I had to tweak them a bit in Illustrator before bringing them into Photoshop. Every time I copy and paste the new version and resize it until I'm happy. Add blend, drop the opacity, add a layer mask, clean up the picture. Some pictures might need a general cleanup, like this one. The cables look messy and take away from what is supposed to be our grand closing shot. Again, this is not an in-depth retouching tutorial. If you need one, let me know in the comments below so I can get on that. The basics, however, are you want to use the healing brush for subtle imperfections, like this isolated cable here. More distressed areas, however, require manual painting with the clone stamp, and then can be softened afterwards with the healing brush. I create a new layer to create a solid black block over the screen. And continue editing and importing as usual. Now with our set, you'll want to crop it to a cleaner frame first. Press C and drag the crop margins around the image. You can adjust these with the boundary boxes. Square it up and press enter. Now let's bring the PSP on the table to life by adding an image. I wanted to make a custom Bart Simpson message, but figured Simpsons already did it, so I just went ahead with what they have. Bring the picture into your work area and press Ctrl T to free transform. Rotate and hold on Shift when resizing to keep its ratio. Press enter. Adjust the opacity so you can see better, and once it's positioned, hide it and select the lasso tool. With the Bart layer still selected, use the lasso to outline the screen. Press Ctrl-Shift-I to invert the selection and then press delete. Now adjust the opacity as you see fit. The last element we'll add is some foam to the coffee mug to make it look like it's full. Ideally, you'd want to find a source image that's as close in angle to the set as possible. This looks pretty good. Bring it into the work area and position it. Drop the opacity down a little so we can see what we're doing. Now go to Edit, Transform, and select Warp. Warp, in case you're wondering, does exactly that. It allows you to manipulate the image based on a 9-block grid. Handles at the corners give you contours, while the points in between can be positioned to lengthen or shorten areas as necessary. As you're doing this, you're imagining it sitting inside of the coffee mug. Once you're happy, press enter. Now we'll add a layer mask and use the elliptical marquee tool to draw a general selection. I'm using Ctrl D to deselect each unsuccessful selection. It can take a bit of finesse. Once you've made a good selection, press Ctrl-Shift-I to invert the selection and fill it with black. Now use a simple brush to clean up the edges. Here I move into the territory of the foam a little to give it a bit more depth. And there we go. Now just for some final edits and we can move on. Okay, now we're really ready to turn these images into cartoons. And to do that, we'll start by creating a duplicate of our edit layer. Call it Ink Outline. Now go to Filter and then Filter Gallery. The filter we're looking for is under Brush Strokes and is called Accented Edges. Note that there is a filter called Ink Outlines already, which can also look pretty cool, but we're using accented edges on this tutorial. Play with the edge width and brightness until you get a comfortable stroke around the objects in your picture. From here, add a layer mask and start painting everything that isn't the outlines away. We're doing this to restore the details while maintaining the beautiful strokes we just created. A mask allows you to paint freely without worrying about messing up the picture. If you make a mistake, you can always just erase from your layer mask. Here you can see how drastic such a simple effect can be. And here you see just how little of the outline layer actually remains. Remember, no single filter or effect creates this. It's every little bit adding together that creates the final product. I wasn't happy with how messy this still looked, so I spent a bit more time cleaning it up. Sometimes things like this can seem pointless, but after the fact anyone would be able to feel the difference. Last thing we want to do is bring this controller to life. It's supposed to be the hero of the story, but right now it looks more like an item from Fallout. We'll start by creating a copy of the background. Call it controller highlight, and use the elliptical marquee tool to draw a general selection around it. Press Ctrl-Shift-I to invert the selection and press delete. Now select the pen tool and start tracing around the controller. You can also use the eraser tool or layer masks to achieve this, but I find the pen tool to be the cleanest and most accurate. Keep it to just the top face of the controller. Now right click on your pen path and click Make Selection. We don't want to feather it, so leave it at 0 and say OK. Now press Ctrl-Shift-I again to invert and press delete. Ctrl-D to deselect. Now, using the elliptical marquee tool, cut out all the buttons. Use the pen tool to cut out the directional pad. And now a quick and nifty trick. I select the black portion I want to remove, then choose the Subtract from Selection option up top, and then select the area in the center I don't want to remove. I use Ctrl-Z to undo until I nail the selection just right. Then you simply hit delete and voila! Now grab the healing brush and clean up the dirt marks. These small things seem like time wasters but really add to the quality of your work. Once it's clean, go to Image, Adjustments, and let's edit its brightness. Take the brightness and push it way up to really bring out the white. Move the layer above our ink outline and wow, what a difference. Last thing we'll do is grab the eraser on a low flow and opacity and start going around the edges and into the details of the controller. What we're doing here is bringing back some of the stroke texture from our ink outline that we've now lost. It helps to use a soft brush and do multiple passes until you reach the level of detail that you like. The shading also does a lot to bring back depth after the flattening effect of blasting the white all the way up. And that's the last edit we'll be making to the panels. Let's start a new project in Photoshop. By this time you should have installed the PSD covers extension I mentioned at the start of this video. If you haven't, the link is down in the description. Once installed, go to Window, Extensions, and choose PSD covers. And here it pops up. Now in the search bar type the word free. This shows only the mockups available for us to use. Under this I button over here, you can see the different categories available. We're looking for brochure. And the brochure we're going to be using is called Pamphlet 009. Select it and it will bring us to a new window. Scroll down to where you see 2 steps and select step 1. This will signal the extension to start creating the template file. From here, it's important to note the guidelines set up. Don't ever touch them. And the instructions placed on the document. You can delete those. We can basically delete all of this too. Even this page's texture layer I left behind for some reason. Now go to File and select Place. Find your panel PSDs and let's start importing. Once placed, you can resize and position them into a temporary spot. First, I'm going to import all the panels. I start to position the next panel and then my ADD kicks in again, and I decide that this needs a paper texture right now. So I find a free one online and I've included it in the links. I mess around with its levels and settings a bit until I'm happy with it. And back on track. Now we resume positioning the panels. Start off in big chunks and then refine your placements as you progress. When it comes time to save your document, create a new folder for it and call it something like Book 1 Step 1. This means that it's the first attempt and it's the first step of that attempt. I'm using a layer mask to crop the images here. Because it's non-destructive, I can always change it later if I like. Next, double click on the layer icon to bring up the layer style box. Select stroke and change the stroke size. Here I choose 10, but I change it to 15 later. I found it useful here to set up extra guidelines to keep myself from running too far into the gutters. As you progress with your layout, you can start adding text boxes, but first let's clean up this project a little bit. Create a new folder and call it Panels. Select all your panel layers using Shift and drop them into the folder. Now create a text layer and write your first bit of text. Create a new layer and call it Text Box 1. Draw a selection around your text with the marquee tool and use Ctrl Backspace to fill it with white. Make sure the text layer is on top. Now we can add a drop shadow using the layer style box again. I should mention at this point that all the text boxes and explosive text we make now are only to guide us as a reference through the animation in tutorial 2. So don't spend too much time trying to make these look perfect like I'm doing obsessively right over here. You can move your text and text box into a new folder and then duplicate that whole folder. This is a great trick to know when you have to create multiple iterations of the same element with only slight changes between them. Here, however, I decide we need a thought bubble instead and use the elliptical marquee tool. Here I decide against using a red dot. Here I'm creating a rectangular guide that we'll use to modify the layer mask for this panel. Control click on the guide's icon in the layer panel to turn its outline into a selection. Now with the layer mask for the panel selected, use Ctrl Backspace to fill it with black and mask that area out. You might notice that strokes can act weird and become wonky when doing this. If this happens, I found it's usually best to clear your entire layer mask, redo your selection, and then add the stroke afterwards. Here we grab another comic book element and clean it up a bit first in Illustrator. Refine it a bit more. Press A to toggle direct select and draw around only the vector points you want to influence. Now I can use Shift and the directional keys to move them along. Now select the whole thing and bring it into Photoshop. There's an amazing tool that's perfect for manipulating long flowy objects like this. Go to Edit and select Puppet Warp. Now the way this works is that you add pins and use them to influence your image. The only thing pins are affected by are other pins, and by pinning and moving appropriately, you can distort images in some very useful ways. Here we start adding the other text elements, but remember that these are only to guide us, so don't spend too much time on these. At this point, I create a solid black rectangle over the area at the far right of the page. This helps black out where I don't need to be and keeps the work where it's supposed to be. Now create a new layer and call it Left Page. Draw a selection around the left side to the guideline. Use the gradient tool and drag a selection across. Press Ctrl T to free transform and bring it in towards the center. Drop the opacity a little. Now duplicate the layer by pressing Ctrl J and bring it in even more. Do this one more time. Now select all three layers and press Ctrl E to merge them together. Duplicate this layer. Use Ctrl T to transform and hold Shift while rotating to turn it 180 degrees. Move it to the other side of the left page. Select these two layers and merge them together. Duplicate this layer and rotate it 180 degrees again to form the right page. Once the layout is finalized, we're ready to move on. Start by hiding all the text elements and making a final save. Now go back to Window, Extensions, PSD Covers. Get back to Pamphlet 009 and this time select Step 2. And just like that, it builds our artwork onto the pamphlet. Now just to save it under a different name. This allows us the freedom to go back to Step 1 later on should we wish to. Last thing to do is ensure that the background layer that the extension automatically creates is hidden. Save the file again. We're going to open our background PSD. And now we're going to place the final book layout we just created. Use the free transform box to position and scale it as needed. Next, add a drop shadow to our comic. For a final touch, I decided to go back to FreePick and grab a cool coffee stain vector. Here you can see the importance of saving different versions. This way it's incredibly easy to update your work. I noticed an artifact appear during export, but this was a simple touch-up with the clone stamp tool. Back in the other project, if you right-click the layer of a linked file, you have the option to select Replace Contents. Using this, we don't even need to reposition the file upon import. God, I love Adobe. We can save this file now as our final set. And with that, we're done with the designing of our setup for the comic book intro. I hope you had as much fun as I did making this, and most importantly that you learned some useful tricks, tips, or workflow secrets. Please give a like if you enjoyed this and subscribe for more tutorials like this one in the future. And now that you're ready, why not jump over to the animation tutorial and let's turn this project into a fully animated work of art. Thanks so much for watching.